All right, ladies, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm Jolene, and this is my co-founder, Alosi here, and we are so excited to talk to you all today about social media in podcasting. So I am going to share my screen. One moment. Okay, and let's start here. All right. So, our presentation today is about why you need a social strategy for your podcast. And this is something we're so excited to talk about and to bring to you. We love working with podcasters. We are digital marketers. We really focus on connecting brands with culture, and we work with companies and creators to help them build their brands, communicate their brands, find audiences, and really build community online. And like I said, we love working with podcasters because we feel like podcasting is such an innate storytelling medium, and it lends itself so well to creating valuable social content that can really reach people, bring people into the fold. I always feel like we need more podcasts and more podcast listeners, and we think social media is a great way to accomplish those goals. We've worked with brands such as Stitcher and Meta to provide 360 marketing strategies, always with an emphasis on digital media. So, we're going to start today talking about why your podcast needs social. I know this can be kind of like a hot button topic. Oh, and sorry, really quick, we're going to take questions at the end. So, anything you have, feel free to enter it in the chat box or the question box. We will get to it, but we kind of want to get through the whole thing and then go through your questions so we really have time to dive into those. So, why your podcast needs social media? I think this is a really interesting conversation, and we'll get to in this presentation to kind of manage expectations as well. I know there's a lot of discourse and conversation about social media not being that like silver bullet to just automatically create conversions, but we are here to tell you and to let you know, in our opinion, that we still think it's very, very important. So why do you need social media for your podcast? One, obviously awareness. While we feel like the podcast industry is super saturated, there are so many people that have still never listened to a podcast, have not made that part of their daily, weekly media routine. So there are still so many audience members out there that just haven't found that right podcast that's going to hook them in yet, and it could be yours. Social media gives you access to reach a lot of different audiences in relatively inexpensive and easy ways compared to other forms of marketing. So that awareness play is still super critical. Community. So we know that, obviously podcast listening experience is such an intimate experience. And we find that a lot of times when we work with podcasters, their audiences are looking for places to find each other. So I know for my favorite podcast, I'm like trying to get my friends to listen because I need to talk about it, right? But I also love being able to follow a show on Instagram and go and comment my thoughts about an episode, find other people. I have, met people in Facebook groups, right, that listen to similar podcasts around interests. So social media really gives you that opportunity to create a central space for a community around your show. Content. I think on social media, it also provides you a really interesting place to expand upon the content you're already making. Like we said, podcasters are natural storytellers. You're doing the work, you're doing the research, you're putting together a show. And I think social can be a great extension of the content you're already creating to expand upon it, to go deeper, to add to it, and create that kind of 360 experience for your listenership. Revenue. I think obviously, getting, brands to sponsor your podcast, there's additional opportunity on social media to do that, right? So when you're creating, brand packages for your sponsors, doing something on social can be something that will provide you increased revenue and an upsell to a sponsor, which I think is always great to have. And then, of course, lastly, conversions. So the point of all of this, right, is to bolster and expand the audience for your podcast, which is something that we feel like social can be a really key driver of. It's not a quick, easy, turn the lights on and it goes solution, but it is something that can be a real driver and a real engine behind getting that visibility and building a listenership for your podcast. So, talking about your journey on social. So, this is the slide. I feel like I've been doing it, but we do kind of want to manage expectations. So, it isn't going to be a silver bullet for podcast success, but it's still a critical component to building your brand. And we wanted to kind of list out some things that you can expect as you create your social handles and you start to populate them and engage with the community on there. What you can expect to do and find within like your first 6 months to a year. And our goal here is to also show you what that world of creating the social profile for your podcast can be beyond just that quick conversion. There is a journey and there are other things that are important about it beyond just that like one-to-one. So finding your people, like we said, reaching people that would have otherwise never known you exist, or people that may be casual fans. This can bring them deeper into your brand and into the podcast. People that maybe slightly know you exist, but they get the context they need on social. They're like, oh, that's their point of view. That's what they talk about. Maybe I will give this a listen, right? So there's so many ways to find your people on social. And I think that that is something that you can obviously expect to do as you begin your profile. Connecting with your audience. So that audience that you've already built with your podcast, really deepening that relationship. I think this presents a huge opportunity to do that via interactive tools and creating a space for them to sound off about your content. I think can be really, really meaningful to people that are loyal listeners and who just want more from you. Expanding your creator community. This is something we hear a lot. I think being active on social, talking about your podcast on social, creating content around your podcast, not only connects you with potential listeners, but also other creators, other people that are in the space that are doing similar things that may be aligned. I think it's a great way to source additional guests, to get, new people in your network that kind of build out the universe of your podcast. And social is a great way to do that. And then, of course, converting social followers to listeners. So it won't happen overnight, but you will absolutely bring listeners into the fold as you go and as you build your presence online. All right, so one of the questions we always get, which is such a good question, is what platforms should you be on, right? We're living in a world where there's so many different social platforms. And from our perspective, they all do different things for different people, right? So each social platform really has its own unique product, its own unique audience and algorithm to really help creatives tap into those new audiences. And you always want to use the platforms most aligned with your goals, audience, and resources to help you find success on social. Just a quick overview of how we view these different platforms and their personalities. Twitter is obviously super community driven. Instagram is face first, in your face visual. Facebook is ubiquitous. It's massive. It's everywhere. Everyone's on it except younger generations at this point. Pinterest is didactic. It's really educational. And TikTok kind of does all of the above. So it has that community aspect. It's visual. It's everywhere. It's educational. So it's really going to hit all those marks, which is super exciting. And our real recommendation in podcast content marketing, in 99% of cases, we really recommend on focusing on both Instagram and TikTok. We find those happen to yield the best results, really connecting you with communities. And we're going to talk a little bit more about breaking down those two platforms and where to kind of find yourself on them. But something else I wanted to note, the reason we really kind of hone in on Instagram and TikTok is also you can have, a presence on all these different platforms, but we find it also kind of burns people out too, right? If you're like, okay, I have a Twitter and now I need to be tweeting about my podcast all the time. I need to be pinning stuff about stuff that relates back to my podcast or making Facebook posts and managing an entire Facebook group. That can work for some people, but we know most people don't have the time to run 5 different social media profiles. So we really always want people to be able to focus and really stay present on the platforms that make the most sense for them. So knowing that we are talking about TikTok and Instagram, I'm going to give you our point of view on what each platform does. TikTok, fair warning, we're like huge TikTok fans. We think it is still such a rewarding platform for creators, for podcasters, for really anyone with something to say. So yeah, TikTok has a huge untapped audience opportunity and a potential for virality that we really don't see anymore on other social platforms. It's really hard to go viral on Twitter if you don't already have followers. It's really hard to go viral on Instagram these days, right? But TikTok, if you have something to say and it catches in that moment, you can truly go viral in a way that is big. It primarily utilizes vertical video with an emphasis on face-to-camera content. So that's really our talking straight to the camera, and it rewards an authentic and unpolished feel. And the reason we're also kind of giving you these bullet points and guide points on these platforms is also to kind of get you thinking about what fits in most with how you want to create content and the resources that you have. You can truly make really winning content on TikTok with just your phone and yourself, right? So that's something to think about, right? If you're strapped for time, you're strapped for resources, you have your phone, you have your podcast, you have all this amazing content you've created, you can bring that to TikTok in a really, really low key, but effective way. It has an opportunity for establishing a user feedback loop via comments, stitching, and interactive features, including question boxes and polls. So those interactive features are there to really build and cultivate your audience. And it has a live capability to reach existing and new audiences. I think what's really unique about TikTok's live capability is that it's really geared toward reaching new people. Whereas we'll talk about Instagram next, where Instagram tends to be connecting with the people you have following you, which I think is an amazing tool. TikTok will push your live into totally new people's algorithms. So we think that's an incredible opportunity. You do have to reach 1,000 followers before you can go live on TikTok. But once you do, that live feature is a huge boost to your visibility. And then to just kind of break down and rank the demographics that correspond to TikTok, we would say it's primarily starting with Gen Z being the most present, Millennial, Gen X, and Boomer. And again, we list these two because we always want to, be transparent about when you're thinking about your content and what you create and what audience it's for. These are all things you want to consider. So next, going to Instagram. So Instagram has an established audience with entrenched user behavior, making it slower to grow in the way that is different from TikTok. But what's also great about Instagram is because that it has that established audience with that entrenched behavior, we kind of know what people do and don't do and want to see on Instagram. So it does allow you to be strategic. I'm sure most of us have Instagram, have been on Instagram for years, right? We know how we use the app. We kind of know how our friends use the app. We know that we like to send memes to our friends. We know we like to keep up with people around us. We know we like to find new things on that explore page at times, right? We understand our own behavior on there, which makes it easier in some ways to create content for that platform. A great thing about Instagram is it hosts a variety of content types, from static imagery to slideshows and vertical video in the same way that TikTok does with their reels. It prioritizes a curated and more polished visual aesthetic. So I think this is really a key difference between Instagram and TikTok. I know going on TikTok at first, it was jarring for me to see people like in their pajamas with their hair up talking about like really serious stuff. And it works, right? It's really amazing for TikTok. Instagram, as we know, I wouldn't feel as comfortable, going live on Instagram in my pajamas in bed, right? That would feel a little bit weird. So just something to think about as you're creating content and as you're creating content for these individual platforms, what you're creating, how you're presenting it. These are all important things to kind of think about. Again, this platform also has the opportunity for establishing that user feedback loop via comments, duetting, interactive features. I think Instagram, especially Instagram stories, is really, really great for this in being able to connect with your audience, really use those tools that they have embedded in and that people are really comfortable using. So I think this is, a really, really great opportunity on Instagram, as well as just that grid and the comments on the grid just feels like a very familiar place to a lot of people. People can have full conversations in there. It feels very natural. So a great place for your community to really be able to come together. has live capability to primarily connect with your established audience, as we kind of talked about before. Again, live is an incredible tool to do events, to talk to your audience, but you're not going to necessarily reach new heights with that. You're really going to connect with the people that follow you and are in your network. And the way we would rate rank these audiences on Instagram, we would say primarily millennial, older Gen Z, Gen X, and Boomer. So another question we get, and this is something we get from people a lot when they are starting out creating their social profiles, is whether you should do this from your host page, so like your personal social profile, or a brand-driven, branded page. As we know, and this is something we would always say, audiences connect with people before brands, right? When you're talking about your favorite podcast host, you're like, they feel like a friend, you call them by their first name, right? You're not necessarily always talking about the podcast name. You're connecting with the people making the content. So if you are a creator, if you have an existing account where you talk about your work, our guidance would likely be to utilize that profile to create promotional content for your podcast. There are, of course, some exceptions to this rule. There's no hard and fast rule of what you should do. I will say our initial instinct is to always kind of explore that person first approach, especially if you are already on social, you're already talking about it, you just kind of want to go bigger. We would say stay there. But like I said, there are some exceptions. So you can really think about creating a brand specific account if and when there are multiple hosts with varying activity on social and there is a need for a centralized place to post. So I know some shows, they have multiple hosts. Some people may be like super on it and super into social, other people aren't. So it's kind of unweighted. Creating a brand profile can really help people to find and get that perspective from all the different hosts in one place. If your existing social handles are primarily used for personal use and brand content feels incongruent, I know this is a line for some people where it's like, your Instagram is pictures of your kids and your family, and you're not comfortable, inviting people out super outside of your network into that space. This is really kind of like a personal feeling and preference. Again, I think people want that familiarity and they want that closeness with the people that they listen to and the people that they follow. But again, if it's going to hold you back from posting, I would absolutely advise to create a brand profile. If it feels like, oh, I'm doing too much and I want to talk more about the podcast, but I feel like I'm spamming my friends and family, that's the feeling you get, then I would say create the brand profile where you feel free to create and talk and build that audience there. If you're really looking to create a space online to engage and attract fans, super fans to grow over time, I think a brand page can really help you achieve that, where again, you have no limitations. You can talk specifically about the brand. You can also do, those sponsored posts, expanding your revenue opportunities. I think a brand page would really help with that. And then if you need a dedicated space to share behind the scenes and intimate content about the podcast regularly. So these are just some reasons why it may make sense to create a brand page. Again, I really think it's a matter of where you feel comfortable posting is what you should be cultivating. And one note we always want to advise, if you do decide to go the route of creating a brand profile, you have to remember that it is an account that needs to be populated. It needs to be populated with people. It needs to be populated with content. There is going to be some legwork involved to cross-post to wherever you're posting now, move users there, and find new users, right? So I think a lot of people, even, people that are celebrities that have, their podcast handles. It's like, why is no one following it? It's like, well, you have to kind of do that work to bring people over, to make them aware, to incentivize them to follow. So just knowing that that's what goes into it, hopefully this gives you some guidance on thinking about how you want to show up online. And these are two really great examples of host-driven versus brand-driven profiles. So the first one is Saeed Jones. He is one of the 3 hosts of the podcast Vibe Check, which we love. You can see here, they do not have a Vibe Check brand handle. But he and his co-host actually do some really great promotion on their own social media handles. So all three of them have background in journalism and in the media space. So they had pretty significant followings as they started the podcast. And what they are able to do is they will post weekly, like clockwork, about the podcast. They have memes that they share and tag each other in around the podcast content. So while it's not, a vibe check page, if you're following these three people that are hosts, you're going to get that podcast content primarily in your stories. I think he does a good job of managing it. You'll see here he, pinned his podcast, a mention for Vibe Check right up top. It's in his bio. So the podcast does have a presence, and it has a presence consistently in his stories while remaining a personal profile for him. And then another example that we love is Podcrush. So this is a podcast, and one of the hosts is actually Penn Badgley. So they've created a Podcrush Instagram, TikTok. It all lives independently, and they're really great about populating it with podcast clips as well as creating content for social. They have it down to a science where they're posting, their guests for each time they're on. They just have a really good also interaction with their audience on there. And you'll see they've been able to build up quite a following here. Of course, it helps that Penn Badgley is associated with it, but it took work for him to bring his fans to convert to podcast listeners and social followers of the podcast. So these are just two different examples. I would totally advise checking both of them out, and you can kind of see how it works in all of these different ways. But like I said, it's really about what is going to make you feel excited and empowered to post online, and whether that's doing it and building up your own personal profile versus a brand page. Both are totally fine for different reasons. Okay, so next we wanted to talk about the difference between podcast promo posts versus podcast content. So I think we're all pretty familiar with the idea of posting like episode out now, right? Guest, episode title, an image, or even an audiogram, right? That feels very directly related to the podcast. That's just like, listen here, listen now, right? And then we also really want to kind of go into, to get your wheels turning, about creating podcast content. So the difference is that podcast promotional posts are really straightforward. Listen to my podcast. Here it is. Come on over. Whereas promotional content is really made for social media first, right? It feels additive. It feels entertaining. It feels educational. It is in service of the podcast without it being solely about the podcast, right? So we really think about this organic promotional content as a way to bring people in deeper, and to give people a taste of what you're doing on your podcast online. It's really about showcasing your sensibilities, who you are, what you're about, what your expertise is, in exciting ways that appeal to people on social, but will bring them further into the fold. So wanted to go through some examples here. So I'm going to be giving examples from a podcast called Love to See It, which we have worked with and we love working with. They've done a really great job of creating a lot of different content on social. So I kind of want to walk you through. So the first example is really about a podcast promotional post. This is what we're talking about. Episode title, live now, what the podcast is, straightforward, right? Which I think, as if you're a listener of this podcast, you may look at this and be like, oh my God, a new episode's out. Let me go listen right now. But if you have never heard of the podcast, if you're not in it, I don't know if this would bring you far down the funnel, right? Like you might be like, okay, it's a podcast, but I don't really know. I don't know if it's for me. I don't know what it's about. So I wanted to walk you through some examples of promotional content. So they've done a really good job, like I said, of doing a bunch of different stuff, which makes it super fun to go through. But something they do really great is, I feel like they bring out their personalities via their social platforms. So this is this really funny kind of like meme format, like video meme format that was going around, where people are kind of showing themselves as different video game characters. So they primarily really focus on The Bachelor. So they're saying, choose your finale character, Emma. She's got her laptop for notes. She has a coffee to fuel late night recording, a roll of toilet paper to wipe tears, right? So this is showcasing their unique personality, their sense of humor, centered around The Bachelor. So someone who loves The Bachelor would see this and be like, I relate, or I'm getting hyped for the finale, or, just see it and find it amusing. Another thing they do is they recap movies. I thought this was really cute how they made a movie list. Again, this is something that is valuable to people beyond what the podcast is doing, but is also relevant to the podcast because you can look at these movies and if you're the kind of person that loves a holiday movie, these are your people. This is what they're talking about on the podcast. So this is shareable, it's additive, it's informational, and it still brings them forward while promoting the podcast in more interesting ways. This is their assistant, or she's like a producer, Tatiana. So she did a really funny video reacting to the ladies of Joey's season. Again, like great content that feels really fun and exciting for people to see, especially if you're a fan of The Bachelor, and showcases their personalities, their sense of humor, their point of view. They have like a kind of a unique point of view on The Bachelor, and I think it comes through in all their content, which would bring people into the fold. They made this really cute meme with Selena Gomez, Taylor Swift, really talking about love to see it, really be giving their audience this like tea and giving them this insider info, and how Bachelor Nation is like, let me in on it, right? So I think this is a great post, kind of showcasing, rewarding their existing listenership, but making people feel like, oh, what am I missing out on? Like, what's love to see it going to tell me that everyone's going to want to know, right? So being really creative and fun and playful, I think it rewards them on social. And then this last one is really them kind of taking just like a hot take about what they talked about on their podcast, talking about, can the Golden Bachelor save the franchise? This is something that was discussed on their podcast. This is something that people were talking about. I know within the Bachelor community, this was a big conversation. So giving their point of view up front, kind of inciting interest. I know people that were kind of out of the loop with the Bachelor may have come back into the fold for this season, and kind of offering themselves not only as a podcast about The Bachelor, but, part of this resurgence, and can guide people back into the franchise. So I love these examples because I feel like they just give you kind of a wide range to see what we're talking about when we talk about promotional content, and why we think it's so important. I'm sure you can relate as a user to understand, the difference between seeing a listen now visual and something like this. I think our behaviors would all be different. And I think it would really pique interest towards the podcast in a way that, those standard promotional assets, while important, are not everything. And when we tell people to get on social, this is really what we're talking about. So going into kind of getting on social, we develop content strategies for a living. We love doing it. We spend a lot of time really diving deep into not only what people have to say, the best way to say it, where to say it, and everything that goes into that, from identifying those points to creating an infrastructure to make sure that it's something they can do and repeat over time. Because while we know content is so fun to consume, it can be a lot to create, right? So while we can't go into all of that today, we did want to offer you just some top line places to get started if you're either looking to get started in, getting on social, creating content around your podcast, or it's something you're doing and you're like, how can I do more? How can I, up level this, or maybe just a refresh to kind of check in with yourself. So the first thing to do when always thinking about creating content is really identifying your people. So you want to identify your core group of people that you're talking to with your podcast. And what's great, again, about podcasters, about doing this work, is you all know this, right? Like, who you're talking to every week, who you're connecting with, your audience, what they want. So I think you'll be able to really have a head start in honing in on this, as opposed to like a brand that may be starting from a different place. So we advise that you identify that one core group, as well as 2 accessory communities that your podcast speaks to. So who is that core audience? And then who are 2 audiences that may not be in that core audience, but could be interested, or maybe your podcast touches on things that are of interest to them that may not be completely apparent at first. But really identifying those people, mapping them out, thinking about who they are, what they want, where they are. Just asking yourself those questions can be so illuminating and can be such a great spark when creating content. And then you want to just top level, find your beats. So ask yourself a few questions to define some top line tentpoles to guide your content. So we bring up the word tentpoles a lot in our work, and tentpoles are really repeatable content filters that you can do over time. So maybe, someone like, love to see it. They talk about The Bachelor, right? So they may do a fun moment in Bachelor history. The show's been on for however many years now, right? So if they're looking for things to just pump out with content, they have such a wealth of information about The Bachelor and about these crazy, funny moments that have happened for years. So a tentpole for them could be like, moments in Bachelor history, or, biggest icks in Bachelor history that they can do, every couple of weeks or every week that, engages their audience, and doesn't put so much weight on them to figure out every time, what am I going to post about? So I'm not starting from ground zero. So as you're developing those tentpoles and those spaces where you really have a right to play, these are some questions you can ask yourself. You should really think critically about who your audience is and ask yourself what they want to hear about. Ask yourself where your podcast adds value to the online discourse. I think part of this is also being online yourself. We do a lot of work with trying to demystify TikTok for people, and we find one of the biggest hurdles is just getting people on the platform. I know for me, I was like, I don't know what this is. I don't know if this is for me. Doesn't feel like, my people are on there. But after spending a couple hours on there, I was like, yes, my people are absolutely on here. We're talking politics, we're talking fashion, we're talking beauty, we're talking pop culture, right? There's so much going on. And once you spend time on the platforms really digging into those spaces, you'll get a sense of who the people are that are kind of maybe leading conversations at the moment, what they're talking about, how they're talking about it. And not to say that that means you have to replicate what anyone else is doing, but I think it will inspire you and give you ideas about where you can kind of insert yourself. And then a huge question, and I think it's really important to ask yourself and be super honest with yourself, is how do you feel most comfortable showing up online? Of course, we always advocate for people to, get out there and put themselves out there. But I think, whether that you're someone that feels comfortable picking up a phone, talking to your camera and posting it, or you're someone that's like, I'm a podcaster. I got into this because I didn't want to be seen, right? I want to be behind a mic. I want to have that distance. Those are questions you can really ask yourself and be honest, because I think forcing yourself into a content type that doesn't feel natural or feel safe for you is not going to make you feel inspired to create content. So if you are like, I don't really feel comfortable being face first for now, maybe down the line, there are still absolutely, pieces of content you can create from that love to see it, those examples, creating those lists, those infographics, creating some more dynamic quote cards, creating video that doesn't necessarily center yourself. There are ways that you can absolutely show up online without being an influencer or being a creator. But I think being really clear with yourself about what you are comfortable with and what you're not comfortable with will allow you to explore those areas and not feel discouraged, like, oh, I'm not doing it right, or I should be doing this, but I don't feel comfortable doing that yet. And I do think too, the more you show up online in various ways and experiment, I think things do become more comfortable and feel more accessible. But give yourself that time, give yourself that space to feel inspired, to feel creative, and to put yourself out there in ways that feel accessible. And then the fun part is creating and letting the data speak back to you. Put out content and let the data guide where you lean in and pull back. So we always say data is your audience's way of speaking to you. You'll see, what kind of you may create a post that was like, oh, I guess I'll just put this out, and it takes off. And then you're like, oh, people really want this. They want to hear more about this. They like information delivered in this way. The data will show you that. The feedback will show you that. And that's a really fun and exciting part, is getting that feedback, starting that feedback loop, and letting that really guide future decisions. So that's also to say that when you are continuing to build or create a social strategy, there is no world in which you're supposed to have it figured out all the way at the beginning, right? So knowing that you have a strategy, you know where you can talk, what you can talk about, who you're talking to, where to do it, how you want to do it, having an idea of that, and then being open to shifting and changing as you get feedback, I think is like the magic combo. Something else that we find really helps people organize their thoughts around content is thinking about cultural moments. So we've listed some kind of, general ones here, but creating a personalized to you content calendar for the year will also help you prepare for relevant cultural moments and content opportunities. This calendar can fluctuate based on interest, content alignments, and current events. So for example, if your podcast is about mental health, you may have a completely different list that talks about, different awareness months or different events throughout the year that feel super aligned. These again are just kind of the general ones. Something too that I think is really fun is once you're kind of in the content space and you have your strategy and you're activating it, being able to react to things that happen in wider culture that relate to your podcast is super valuable. So that's why I love this example here. This is when White Lotus was on, and it was like the talk of everything on social media. So this podcast, the Man Enough podcast, did a TikTok where they said, White Lotus characters in the Man Enough podcast episodes, they should be listening to by the pool. So kind of recommending, episodes to these characters that people have very strong and intense feelings about is a great way to capitalize on a cultural moment that's happening in the wider discourse and making it relevant to your podcast and showcasing your podcast in ways that really excite people and feel natural to what's being talked about online. And then we wanted to also provide some creators for inspiration. So we can absolutely send this out after, but you'll see there's just a wide variety of podcasts that we have here. There are so many different podcasts doing interesting, creative things on social media, from Podcrushed, where they're really utilizing their notable faces for awareness, creating, social content that feels very much of the TikTok culture, where they're adapting video memes and using sounds that feel super relevant, to 99% Invisible, which is an incredible podcast that has really expanded their brand on social, on Instagram with visuals, and a bunch of different content types. So yeah, we will send this out. We always want to provide examples to inspire. I think a lot of times it just takes that one little thing that, makes a bulb go off in your head and that you feel inspired to create. And then lastly, just a heads up, we love the Podcast Academy. Like I said, we love working with podcast creators. So we are offering TPA members an exclusive discount on a podcast audit and strategy session. So our goals with these sessions, again, are always to allow you to break through your existing audience ceiling and really find people who didn't even know they needed you. Social presents such an opportunity to do that. So that's always our goal. Help you connect with your existing community in new and meaningful ways, give you the tools to execute a sound content strategy with the time, materials, and attention span that you have right now. One of the main things we always preach is that we are all about working with what you have, whether that's just a phone, that's doable, right? So really thinking about how many hours you have a week, how much you have to work with, and how much you can really dedicate to that is important to us when creating any strategy. And then creating seamless paths to play, maximizing conversions to your podcast across social. So this is something we really work with clients on is, it's wonderful to create amazing content. You can bring people in, bring them into the community, but there are some tweaks you can make to really make sure you're maximizing that path and making that path from Instagram to the podcast as seamless as possible. Because as we know, it's not the longest path, but it's not the shortest either, right? Going from Instagram to a podcast. So this is something we work with our clients on. We did want to offer something exclusive to TPA for podcasts to really have access to our resources and to our strategic guidance. So if this is something you're interested in learning more about, feel free to check us out at workwithjade.com. And you can also reach out to us at info@workwithjade.com. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And we'd love to open it up to some questions. And I have Alosi with me here who's going to answer some questions with me.
So I see we have a question from Elliot Peltzman. Are there industry standards for measuring audience engagement? Also, what is your favorite way to measure it? So I guess if you're talking about like an overall engagement rate, industry standard is between like 1 to 3% and leaning kind of that 1 to 2%, which is like an engagement of someone who's posting regularly. If you see yourself going over 3%, you have a pretty high engagement rate. If your engagement rate is like 20%, it's time to go to the marketplace and let people know that you're ready for brand deals. And then in terms of our favorite way to measure it, I really like the analytics that social media gives you in terms of how many accounts you're reaching, who is following you. Is it people that already follow you? Is it new people? Because then you'll know, am I already talking to my existing audience or am I talking to a new audience? Because I do think depending on if you're talking to a new or existing audience, you might have to just pivot your content a little bit. You might have to add a clearer call to action if you are, reaching people who don't follow your podcast. So, if you have a business account on Instagram, if you have a business or creator account on TikTok, you can get the analytics in terms of how much impact your content is having. And sometimes they'll let you know, hey, this is doing really well. Do you want to boost it?
It looks like we have a question from Stephanie too, asking, does no-face content work on TikTok?
It does work on TikTok. I don't think it's it does work on TikTok. I really do think it depends on what type of content or service that you are providing. I do think when it comes to a podcast, because it's just audio, you probably could get away with it. But I think especially on TikTok is a human first platform. So even if you are just, letting the podcast play in the background and you're just there on green screen to record, that adds like a human element that makes it feel more human and less promotional. So you can get away with it, but you're always going to, human first content does better on TikTok. There are lots of accounts that have no face accounts. I know I follow a lot of music accounts that have no face, but music and audio, you don't necessarily need a face, but the people who are more personal, I do feel more connected to them.
Same. Logan has a question. Do you have recommendations on what to do when you found previous success on platforms like TikTok, but now your videos are reaching less people than ever?
Well, I don't want to get into the politics of being shadow banned. I do think that TikTok shadow banned some people. But I do think we will always say that the data is your audience trying to tell you something. So I feel like if you are seeing that your content is not doing well, I do think that it is an opportunity to switch up your content a little bit. Maybe it's time to refine your hooks. Maybe you need to make sure on every video you're putting a headline so people can stop and read and be like, oh, wait, what's this video about? There might be little tweak, and we give some of these suggestions when we do audits for people, but there might be, to me, it signals a change that you need to make in your content. The other thing is that you can take old content and remix it. I've done like 3 videos on how to make a media kit, and I'm always interested to see which one does better. And I'm going to continue doing it because it's valuable information. So, take that as an opportunity to pivot and to iterate, and then try because before I go too down the rabbit hole, I feel like when it comes to social media, specifically TikTok, there's the art of making really good content, but then there's also the art of telling the algorithm, this is who my content is for, making sure you're using a headline, make sure you're using post captioning, make sure you're using, the headline in the caption in your actual post, not just closed captioning. There are all these signals that tell TikTok, that's a new SEO platform. Hey, this is who you should push my content out to. There are times we've created content and it may not do well in the beginning, but because it's so SEO optimized, it does well over time, over a year, and because people can keep coming back to it, if that makes sense.
I think those are...
Oh, wait, there's one more question. Liatra Tate, I'm sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. Do you have a recommendation on when to focus on building your brand-driven social, pre-launch, during promo, post-launch? It's evergreen. You don't stop. It is constantly iterating. Even if you guys go to our TikTok page, we have a tiny TikTok. We have 1,000 followers, I think, but we've gotten so much business, so much traction. You know, our videos have a little, because we make good content first, and then we tell the algorithm, send this out to our people, go find it. So I think it is the entire time. There's no, and every time you're going to iterate, because where I am now at 1,000 followers, when I'm at 10,000 followers, or when I'm at 100,000 followers, may not be the same content. It's going to iterate constantly. So I feel like you're always building your brand through social media, whether you're letting them know what type of content you're making, who you are as a person, or who are you looking for as like your people, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Another question, Elliot, do you have recommendations for a traditionally audio first brand, think NPR, that wants to reach the YouTube market? I don't know if I fully understand that question. Do you have a recommendation for a traditional audio first brand, think NPR, that wants to reach the YouTube market? Are you essentially saying for a podcast that wants to go on you? I'm going to look into the chat, Elliot, so you can clarify just in case I'm missing it. But you're asking essentially, would we recommend a podcast being on YouTube? Because if that's, yes, we do recommend. Now, the thing with YouTube, the reason we didn't include YouTube as like a social platform, because YouTube is more of like a content platform, to be honest, a long form content platform. I think if you have the energy to do YouTube, the reason I love doing YouTube and telling podcasts to do YouTube with visuals, I'm going to say with visuals, and that visual could just be you and your phone recording audio. Recording video, is that because YouTube allows you to do long form content. And anytime you have long form content, you can chop that up into pieces that ends up becoming your short form TikTok and Instagram content. So you actually, if you focus, let's say you focus on making your YouTube's visual, even if it's not your entire podcast, let's say it's 20 minutes of your podcast, you could take that 20 minutes of the most poignant parts of your podcast, chop it up, and that becomes what you put on TikTok. It becomes what you put on Instagram. It becomes what you put in your stories. So if I had to say how not to make it boring, optimize your titles, make sure you have visuals. If I personally, unless someone's like super fan of your podcast, they're not just going to listen to your podcast without visuals, because they can do that on Spotify or Apple podcasts or whatever the case may be.
All right, I think I can take this this next question. So we have from an anonymous attendee: what is an easy tool to use for planning content across quarters or the year, and the best tools for planning if you're collaborating with someone else or a team? So my perspective on this, something that we use and that works really well for us in collaboration, is the Google Suite. So I love creating a spreadsheet, and to give you just some insight, like we have our own content spreadsheets, and we start with kind of what we talked about in the presentation, where we have created a spreadsheet where we have, you know, what audience we're talking to, what beat/tentpole it is, right? We have some repeatable ones, we have some one-off things, what platform we're primarily creating this before. And then from there, that gives us the clarity to create some notes. At times, maybe if it's a longer video that's more involved, we might create like a mini script if we're doing, you know, a face to camera video. But just that kind of centralized document where everyone has access, and creating just very basic spreadsheets that keep you focused and allow you to plan out. I think that's something you could absolutely do for the quarter, for the year. Also incorporating that cultural content calendar in there when you define that for yourself and what your places are. That's a great place to just start populating for a year, start thinking about content ideas that correspond, with always keeping in mind who you're speaking to and where you're speaking to them, because that's going to affect how you create the content. So yeah, I think, you know, the info we had in there about, you know, what you should be thinking of could really easily, we create these for our clients, but you can absolutely take that and kind of create your own and populate as you go. And then we have another question from Carolyn, who says, any recs for a tool, maybe with AI, that can be used to pull audio bites from your podcast for promotion on social in the form of an audiogram, for instance?
I know those tools exist. Yeah, Swell does that. Thank you, Stephanie. I was like, I know the tool exists. I can't remember the name of it. That's really great. But the always thing I'm going to say with AI, whether it's ChatGPT, you got to check your work. Having ChatGPT is like having, or AI in general, is like having a fresh Harvard grad who knows everything, but knows nothing without the context you give them. So you just have to make sure that you can, that you're checking the work, making sure that it's not getting marbled, garbled, all sorts of weird stuff because AI is a machine at the end of the day.
Yes, I feel like we've all seen we've all seen some content that you're like, that wasn't written by a human, but it's kind of right, but not. Okay, cool. From Stephanie, we have, how often should we post? You might have answered, I'm at work. Oh, hi, Stephanie.
Hi. Oh, you
Yeah,
want to
I
get that?
think, yeah, I can start. I think how often you should post. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule to this. When building an audience, we would advise the main thing for all like podcast creators is being really diligent about promoting each and every episode that comes out, right? We have people and we've worked with people that are like, I have a podcast and I post about it. And it's like, no, you have to post every single episode the minute it drops because people really count on that to trigger their reminder to listen. You never know the episode that's going to be the one that's like, oh my gosh, I need to deep dive on that, right? So being really intentional about posting each episode, I would advise as like a general overview thought about posting for each episode, I would create 2 to 3 pieces of content for it. So maybe one is that audiogram with additional context and a really great caption, and the other is a meme, or it's a video of you talking about some niche fact from your podcast that you're like, and I talk about this more on my episode that just dropped today, right? So creating that social first promotional content versus just promotional posts. I would think about, maybe trying to do that at least twice minimum for each episode that you drop. And if that's all you can do, that's all you can do. Of course, we love more because we love content, we love podcasts, but that's where I'd start thinking about creating kind of a process and a pattern for yourself.
And it's probably controversial. I don't think that podcasts need to post every multiple times a day. We're not you have to post 2 or 3 times a day. You're not the New York Times. No one is checking for anybody like that. I'm not even checking for like my sister's like that. So I'm like, you don't need to post every day. I think what Jolene said, that 2 to 3 times for every podcast, quality over quantity, where you can test content is always going to be the recommendation. It's better to have one really good post than post 10 times a day and they all flop.
Totally. We have another question. I started an IG for my podcast, but I just really use it to post audiograms and I tag my personal account. Is that okay? I mainly just did it for the hyperlink in my bio. I post the audiograms in my IG stories.
Yes, it's okay to tag your personal account if that is a way that you want your community to be able to find you. I think, yes, the link in bio is, to me, one of the things that makes Instagram most valuable, because you can take people directly to a link that you want to take them to. You posting audiograms in your IG stories, I hate to break this. Anything you post in your stories you're preaching to the choir. Anything you post in reels, think of that as like evangelist. You're knocking door to door and being like, here's the gospel of my podcast. So you have to think about, okay, how and who am I going to engage my existing audience through stories? And then how can I post things in reels specifically? And I say reels because that's what Instagram is prioritizing right now, to be able to attract the audience of your people, if that makes sense. So yes, you continue using that. I think tagging your profile and all of that is great because it allows your personal fans to be able to find you. But I think if you're only using IG stories, you're only preaching to the choir, essentially.
Totally agree. That's a great point. How do we get the audit? Can you say the price or do we need to email? For the audit, please, yeah, you can email us and reach out. Depending on, we would obviously want to send you an intake form and get to know kind of what you're looking for. And then we would give you the price. We're obviously doing like a discount for TPA members, but I don't want to give you just a generalized price if we kind of get to know what you're doing, and then it may range up and down based on that. But please feel free to reach out to us. We don't want price to be a barrier. We don't want it to be like we're not, charging you premium prices. We really want to work with small independent creators. So please don't allow price to be a barrier. We're not doing this to try to spring some big price on you. We're actually doing it to try to make sure we can fit in with people's existing resources and what they have.
I see we have a question in here. What should we use if we wanted to create them ourselves, like Descript? I'm assuming that you're saying if you want to use video, create video clips. I love CapCut. CapCut is actually owned by TikTok, so you're not going to get deprioritizing for uploading a CapCut video to TikTok because they're essentially sister companies. And then I also recommend using the in-app editing tool. That's going to probably prioritize your content over everything. So if you have a video clip and you can edit in the TikTok app, if you can edit it in the Instagram app, the Instagram interface is not as seamless in my opinion. I think that that's also a way. You can also download the clips once you edit them in app. I know on TikTok and I believe on Instagram. You said for audio. Oh, for Carolyn, for audiograms. I do think that's like something you could do in Canva, Adobe Premiere. I'm not the hugest fan of audiograms because I just feel like it's just the audio thing going up and down. I think if you're going to be on social with all of this full use of video, you'd be better off, I think, even doing a slideshow of images that make sense than just using that audiogram thing. I mean, they're not anything, but they're not the most impactful because I think people have just kind of tune them out after a while.
And Michelle, to your point about in-app download will also apply a watermark for the original platform. You're correct. Something we advise people to do if they are really focused on creating, something for multiple platforms, is to record a video like on your phone, on your existing camera, and then upload it to those platforms. You never want to take like a TikTok video with a TikTok watermark and put it on Instagram. That's like a terrible user experience and the algorithm will punish you for it. So if it is something we think, if I'm doing this on TikTok, it's for TikTok, it's staying on TikTok, create it in TikTok. If you want that flexibility, create it outside of any app and then upload it and modify it there. So.
And I was going to say in TikTok, in the drafts, when you're in drafts, you can download without the watermark. You don't want to download it after it's posted because it will have the watermark. But if you're in drafts, there's like a line with an arrow pointing down to it. That is where you can download what you've recorded so far in the TikTok interface.
All right.
Like 2 minutes left.
Yes. Thank you all so much for these great questions. This has been super cool to hear what's on your minds. All right. Well, if we don't have any more questions, this has been such a pleasure and we appreciate you coming and it was so fun. We love talking about social. We love podcasters. We love seeing you all. So please feel free to reach out. We love to follow podcasters and just kind of see what you're doing and provide tips and strategies where we can. And thank you so much again for attending. And we hope to hear from you all soon and sending you all the best wishes in your pursuits of creating content and getting on social and growing your audiences. Thank you. Have a great night, everyone.